Just a few weekends ago, I went on the HUC Spirituality Shabbaton at Camp Elonim in the Simi Valley. During the Shabbaton, I managed to let go of my mind's to-do list and immerse myself in matters of the Spirit. I was surrounded by a community of students and teachers who were there to do just the same. On Shabbat morning, I found myself sitting in a circle on one end of a grassy field, being led in beautiful Shabbat morning prayer by Jay and Laura. The spot that they had chosen was in the perfect amount of shade, allowing us to fully appreciate all of God's creations by which we were surrounded. By the time that we reached the Shema and her blessings, each of us had settled into a peaceful and reflective Shabbat worship experience. Just as Jay quietly led us in singing, V'havienu le'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz. A big bus pulled up at the other end of the grassy field. Within moments, what had been a peaceful and reflective Shabbat worship experience had been interrupted by tens of Israeli teenagers chanting cheers from their youth movement. Hechayotikiyu! Hechayotikiyu! Roar! Roar! We continued to pray, and they continued to cheer. I looked up from my siddur, and I gazed across the field to a group of vibrant Israeli teens. They exuded an energy that was filled with enthusiasm and joy. I noticed that some of them were glancing quizzically at us, a group of men and women, some with and some without, kippot and talitot, sitting in a circle with a Torah scroll wrapped in a talis before us. I imagined that just as I was curious about the nature of their group, so too must they have been curious about the nature of ours. And yet, I remained with my group on my end of the field, and they remained with their group on their end of the field. I continued with my business, that of prayer and spirituality, and they continued with their business with chanting in Hebrew and playing games, also in Hebrew. This week, we read the words from Moses' third and final speech to the people Israel before they would enter into the Promised Land. Moses addresses the people. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem. You all stand on this day, all of you. Moses then goes on to specifically name the categories of people that he is addressing. He begins with the usual suspects, the tribal heads, the elders, and the officials. He then explicitly includes some of the groups who are less likely to be named: the children, the women, the strangers, and the people who do the most menial work. Moses declared that God is making a covenant with all of them. Every member of the people Israel is included in the covenant. But why do we find both the words atem, you all, and kulchem, all of you, in this verse? Gunther Plaut, as we know, a great Reformed Torah commentator of the 20th century, points out that the word kulchem, all of you, means to say each of you and each of your groups are part of the collective. Am Yisrael, the people Israel, at that moment comprised all of its parts. Just after Moses makes clear that all of the people and all of their various groups are in fact included in the covenant, he says the following: Ki et asher yeshno po imanu omed hayom lifnei Adonai Eloheinu, ve et asher einenu po imanu hayom. I make this covenant with those who are standing here today before Adonai our God, and with those who are not here with us today. Who are the people who were not present on that day, but are still, as it were, grandfathered into the covenant? As we know, tradition suggests that these people are actually the souls of future Jewish generations. If then we take for granted that the covenant being made is in the text is between God and all of the people Israel, including all of its subgroups, and all of the future generations and all of their subgroups, it would seem as though all of Am Yisrael, all of the people Israel, are bound to one another because we are all part and parcel of God's covenant. When scholars speak of this notion, they often cite a popular phrase found in the Talmud. It reads, Kol Yisrael aravim zeh b'zeh. All of Israel is responsible for one another. Meir Twersky, one of the Roshei Yeshiva of the rabbinical school at Yeshiva University, encourages us to think about this phrase differently. He teaches that the word aravim, when understood in conjunction with the preposition bet, actually carries the idea of two things being mixed. Therefore, rather than taking the phrase to mean all of Israel is responsible for one another, we should understand it to mean all of Israel is intermingled with one another. With this new reading of the phrase, we can conclude that it is impossible to separate Am Yisrael, the people Israel, into individuals or groups of people. However, in an age where we, as American Jews, choose to live in the diaspora, can we really say that we feel bound to being a part of Am Yisrael? A midrash recounts the tale of a two-headed man. He had two heads, and he married a woman who only had one head. They had children of both the one-headed and two-headed varieties. One of the children with two heads felt that he deserved a double portion of the inheritance because, after all, he possessed two heads. The matter eventually came before the wisest person in the entire world, King Solomon. And King Solomon proposed that one of the child's heads be blindfolded and scalding hot water be poured over the other head, rather. If the blindfolded head cried out in pain, then it would be clear that, in fact, the two heads belong to one being and they only deserve one portion of the inheritance. When the child with the two heads got wind of this plan, the two heads both cried out, "If you pour the scalding water over our heads, we will die. We are one. We are not two. We are one. We are not two." Could not the same thing be said about the two Jewish centers, the one here in North America and the one in Medinat Yisrael? In so many ways, we function separately, but at the end of the day, we feel each other's pain because we are one, we are not two. I was fortunate enough to spend this summer at Olin Saying Ruby Union Institute, the Reform Movement's oldest summer camp in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Camp is a special place where all areas of Jewish life come alive, in no small part thanks to the amazingly talented college students who serve as the camp staff. This year, in addition to the college students, camp brought 31 Israelis to also be part of the staff as the official delegation, or mishlachat, from Israel's Jewish agency. These young Israelis teach our campers and our staff so very much. They teach us about the way that Judaism is lived in Medinat Yisrael. They add a dimension to camp that simply could not be recreated by any other group of people. This summer in particular, amidst all of the terror and violence that was taking place in Israel and in Gaza, this group taught our youth about Hebrew as a living language, about Israeli popular culture, about life in the army, about the landscape of Israel, about Israeli history, and about so much more. However, the Americans were not the only group that benefited from the presence of the Israelis. The Israelis learned a great deal about Judaism and Jewish life from the American staff members and campers. One of the Israelis, Michal, shared with me that over the course of the summer, she found herself enjoying the daily tefillot, the daily prayers that happened at camp. She said that she felt a spiritual connection at camp that she had never felt before. Another mishlachat member, Amit, who did not appreciate having to pray twice daily, came to me on the day when 13 Israeli soldiers had been killed in Gaza. He said that he wanted to incorporate something for the fallen soldiers into our evening prayer, and especially for his friend who was among those killed. The problem, he said, is that I don't really know any prayers. Could you help me? Being immersed in the spirituality of American Jewish summer camp awakened a part of Michal's soul that had lain dormant in her secular life in Israel. And Amit realized that in a time of personal crisis, he lacked the language with which to communicate the feelings of his inner heart to his community and to his God. Ahad Ha'am, one of the pioneering Zionist thinkers, articulated his Zionism through a concept that he called Chibat Zion, a love of Zion, which he argued was just as necessary as political Zionism itself. Chibat Zion was rooted in national culture. Because he wrote only through national culture and for its sake, should a Jewish state be established in such a way as to correspond with the will and needs of the Jewish people? Ahad Ha'am did not live to see the establishment of the Jewish state or the flowering of its culture, though he certainly predicted it. What Ahad Ha'am failed to realize was that there would be a flowering of its own right of Jewish religious culture in North America, the other center of Jewish life. Ahad Ha'am did not grasp that a creative and living Jewish religious culture is the other half of his equation. Though the North American head speaks the language of spirituality, and the Israeli head speaks the language of culture, in fact, we are one, we are not two. In his book, Kol Dodi Dofek, Listen, My Beloved Knocks, the great modern Orthodox thinker Joseph Soloveitchik presents the notion that a Jew who lives out his Judaism only by taking on the suffering of the Jewish people, shutting out all of the joys of Torah, Jewish values, and ritual observances, destroys the essence of Judaism. He also realizes that by the same token, a Jew who is observant but does not feel the hurt of the Jewish people desecrates his Judaism. Soloveitchik reminds us that our two centers can not only act at one in times of crisis. Given the situation in Israel this summer, it is not surprising that many American Jews were engaged in discourse about Israel, its very existence, and its destiny. We American Jews were engaged on the far left, the far right, and everywhere in between. This is good. Political engagement with Israel is good. What's better, though, is human engagement. It is incumbent upon us as Jewish leaders in North America to encourage, facilitate, and foster meaningful interactions between members of our community and members of the Jewish community in Medinat Yisrael. Let's listen to how Yehuda Amichai, the Israeli poet, captures this challenge. He writes, "Once I sat on the steps by a gate at David's tower. I placed my two heavy baskets at my side. A group of tourists was standing around their guide, and I became their target marker. You see that man with the baskets? Just right of his head, there's an arch from the Roman period, just right of his head. But he's moving. Amichai continues. I said to myself, redemption will only come if their guide tells them. You see that arch from the Roman period? It's not so important, but left and down a bit, there's a man who's bought fruit and vegetables for his family. Amichai bemoans the notion that diaspora Jews are but tourists in Medinat Yisrael. What would it take for North American Jews to be more than tourists of the Israeli way of life? What would it take for Israeli Jews to be more than just delegates representing Israel to us Americans? I think back to that beautiful Shabbat morning on the HUC Spirituality Shabbaton. What might my day have looked like had I crossed that grassy field, introduced myself to some of the young Israelis, and struck up a conversation? What might our Shabbat have been like had it been infused with the ruchaniyut, the spirituality from our Shabbaton, and the ruach, the infectious, spirited enthusiasm of those young Israelis? Perhaps Amichai was right. Perhaps had any of us or any of them figured out how to cross that grassy field, redemption might have come.